Only last year, a party of 10 American oil engineers had been found killed by poisoned arrows in the eastern part of Ecuador, where many Indians still went about in the jungle stark naked and hunted with poisoned arrows. Next day, we were sitting with our own Consul General Bryn and his wife under the eucalyptus trees of their big country place outside the town. Bryn said there were robbers about in those very regions we had thought of visiting. He produced clippings from local papers announcing that soldiers were to be sent out when the dry season came to extirpate the bandidos who infested the regions around Quevedo. To get there now was sheer madness, and we would never get guides or transport. While we were talking to him, we saw a jeep from the American military attache's office tear past us along the road, and this gave us an idea. We went up to the American embassy, accompanied by the consul general, and were able to see the military attaché himself. He was a trim, light-hearted young man in khaki and riding boots, and he asked laughingly why we had strayed to the top of the Andes when the local papers said we were to go to sea on a wooden raft. We explained that the wood was still standing upright in the Quevedo jungle, and we were up here on the roof of the continent and could not get to it. We asked the military attaché either A, to lend us a plane and 2 parachutes, or to lend us a jeep with a driver who knew the country. The military attaché at first sat speechless at our assurance. Then he shook his head despairingly and said with a smile, "All right." Since we gave him no third choice, he preferred the second. Over the Andes by jeep. At 5:15 the next morning, a jeep rolled up to our hotel entrance, and an Ecuadorian captain of engineers jumped out and reported himself at our service. His order was to drive us to Quevedo, mud or no mud. The jeep was packed full of gasoline cans, for there were no gasoline pumps or even wheel tracks along the route we were to take. Our new friend, Captain Agerto Alexis Alvarez, was armed to the teeth with knives and firearms on account of the reports of bandidos. We had come to the country peacefully in business suits to buy timber for ready money down on the coast, and the whole of our equipment on board the jeep consisted of a bag of tinned food, except that we had hurriedly acquired a second-hand camera and a pair of tear-proof khaki breeches for each of us. In addition, the consul general had pressed upon us his big revolver with an ample supply of ammunition to exterminate everything that crossed our path. The jeep whizzed away through empty alleys where the moon shone ghostly pale on whitewashed adobe walls, till we came out into the country and raced at a giddy speed along a good sand road southward through the mountain region. It was good going all along the range, as far as the mountain village of Latacunga, where windowless Indian houses clustered blindly round a whitewashed country church with palms in a square. Here we turned off along a mule track, which undulated and twisted westward over hill and valley into the Andes. We came into a world we had never dreamed of. It was the mountain Indians' own world, east of the sun and west of the moon, outside time and beyond space. On the whole drive, we saw not a carriage or a wheel. The traffic consisted of bare-legged goatherds in gaily colored ponchos, driving forward disorderly herds of stiff-legged, dignified llamas, and now and then whole families of Indians coming along the road. The husband usually rode ahead on a mule, with his little wife trotted behind him with her entire collection of hats on her head, and the youngest child in a bag on her back. All the time that she ambled along, she spun wool with her fingers. Donkeys and mules jogged behind at leisure, loaded with boughs and rushes and pottery. We went on up over sun-smitten slopes without a bush or tree, and down into valleys of desert sand and cactus, till finally we climbed up and reached the topmost crest with snowfields round the peak and a wind so bitingly cold that we had to slacken speed in order not to freeze bits as we sat in our shirts longing for jungle heat. For long stretches we had to drive across country between the mountains, over scree and grassy ridges, searching for the next bit of road. But when we reached the west wall, where the Andes range falls precipitously to the lowlands, the mule track was cut along shelves in the loose rock, and sheer cliffs and gorges were all about us. We put all our trust in friend Agerto as he sat crouched over the steering wheel, always swinging out when we came to a precipice. Suddenly a violent gust of wind met us. We had reached the outermost crest of the Andes chain, where the mountain fell away sharply in a series of precipices to the jungle far down in a bottomless abyss, 12,000 feet beneath us. But now our road ran down unhindered into the depths, always down in steep loops along gorges and bluffs and ridges, while the air grew damp and warmer and ever full of the heavy, deadening hothouse air which rose from the jungle world below. And then the rain began, first gently. Then it began to pour and beat upon the jeep like drumsticks, and soon the chocolate-covered water was flowing down the rocks on every side of us. We almost flowed down too, away from the dry mountain plateaus behind us and into another world where stick and stone and clay slope were soft and lush with moss and turf. Leaves shot up. Soon they became giant leaves hanging like green umbrellas and dripping over the hillside. There was a gurgling and splashing everywhere. Then the jungle rolled up swiftly, like an army of green giant growths that swallowed up the little jeep as it splashed along the waterlogged clay road. The air was moist and warm and heavy with the smell of vegetation. In the jungle. Darkness had fallen when we reached a cluster of palm-roofed huts on a ridge. Dripping with warm water, we left the jeep for a night under a dry roof. The horde of fleas that attacked us in the hut were drowned in the next day's rain. With a jeep full of bananas and other tropical fruit, we went on downhill through the jungle, down and down, though we thought we had reached the bottom long ago. The mud grew worse, but it did not stop us, and the robbers kept at an unknown distance. Not till the road was barred by a local river of muddy water rolling down through the jungle did the jeep give up. We stood stuck fast, unable to move either up or down along the riverbank. In an open clearing stood a hut where a few half-breed Indians were stretched out on jaguar skin on a sunny wall, while dogs and fowl were splashing about enjoying themselves on top of some cocoa beans spread out to dry in the sun. When the jeep came bumping along, the place came to life, and some natives who spoke Spanish informed us that this was the Rio Palenque and that Quevedo was just on the other side. There was no bridge there, and the river was swift and deep, but they were willing to float us and the jeep over by raft. The queer contraption lay down by the bank. Twisted logs, as thick as our arms, were fastened together with vegetable fibers and bamboo to form a flimsy raft, twice the length of our jeep. With a plank under each wheel and our hearts in our mouths, we drove the jeep out onto the logs. And though most of them were submerged under the muddy water, they did bear the jeep and us and 4 half-naked chocolate-colored men who pushed us off with long poles. "Balsa?" Herman and I asked together. "Balsa," one of the fellows nodded, with a disrespectful kick at the logs. The current seized us, and we whirled down the river while the men pushed in their poles at the right places and kept the raft on an even diagonal course across the current and into the quieter water on the other side. This was our first meeting with the balsa tree and our first trip on a balsa raft. We brought the raft safely to land at the farther bank and motored triumphantly into Quevedo. 2 rows of tarred wooden houses with motionless vultures on the palm roofs formed a kind of street, and this was the whole place. At Quevedo. Don Frederico's plantation lay a bit further down the river. When the jeep came bumping into the yard along a path between the mango trees, with Agurto, Herman, and me, the lean old jungle dweller came to meet us at a trot with his nephew, Angelo, a small boy who lived with him out in the wilds. We gave messages from Don Gustavo, and soon the jeep was standing alone in the yard while a fresh tropical shower streamed down over the jungle. There was a festive meal in Don Frederico's bungalow. Suckling pigs and chickens crackled over an open fire, while we sat round a dish loaded with tropical fruit and explained what we had come for. The jungle rain pouring down on the ground outside sent a warm, sweet gust of scented blossoms and clay in through the window netting. Don Frederico had become as brisk as a boy. Why, yes, he had known balsa rafts since he was a child. 50 years ago, when he lived down by the sea, the Indians from Peru still used to come sailing up along the coast on big balsa rafts to sell fish in Guayaquil. They could bring a couple of tons of dried fish in a bamboo cabin in the middle of the raft, or they might have wives and children and dogs and fowl on board. Such big balsa trees as they had used for their rafts would be hard to find now in the rains, for flood water and mud had already made it impossible to get to the balsa plantation up in the forest, even on horseback. But Don Frederico would do his best. There might still be some single trees growing wild in the forest near the bungalow, and we did not need many. Next morning we got up early to go and search for the balsa trees. "Better shake our clothes," said Agurto, and as he spoke a scorpion fell out of his shirt sleeve and shot down into a crack in the floor. Soon after sunrise, Don Frederico sent his men out on horseback in all directions to look for accessible balsa trees along the paths. Our own party consisted of Don Frederico, Herman, and myself, and we soon found our way to an open place where there was a gigantic old tree of which Don Frederico knew. It towered high above the trees round about, and the trunk was 3 feet thick. In Polynesian style, we christened the tree before we touched it. We gave it the name Ku, after a Polynesian deity of American origin. Then we swung the axe and drove it into the balsa trunk till the forest echoed our blows. But cutting a sappy balsa was like cutting cork with a blunt axe. The axe simply rebounded, and I had not delivered many strokes before Herman had to relieve me. The axe changed hands time after time, while the splinters flew and the sweat trickled in the heat of the jungle. Late in the day, Ku was standing like a cock on one leg, quivering under our blows. Soon he tottered and crashed down heavily over the surrounding forest, big branches and small trees being pulled down by the giant's fall. We had torn the branches from the trunk and were beginning to rip off the bark in zigzag in Indian style when Herman suddenly dropped the axe and leaped into the air as if doing a Polynesian war dance, with his hand pressed to his leg. Out of his trouser leg fell a shining ant as big as a scorpion and with a long sting at its tail. It must have had a skull like a lobster's claw, for it was almost impossible to stamp it under one's heel on the ground. "A Congo," Don Frederico explained with regret. "The little brute's worse than a scorpion, but it isn't dangerous to a healthy man." Herman was tender and sore for several days, but this did not prevent his galloping with us on horseback along the jungle paths, looking for more giant balsas in the forest. From time to time we heard creaking and crashing and a heavy thud somewhere in the virgin forest. Don Frederico nodded with a satisfied air. It meant that his half-breed Indians had felled a new giant balsa for the raft. In the week, Ku had been followed by Kane, Kama, Ilo, Maori, Ra, Rangi, Papa, Taranga, Kura, Kukara, and Hiti. 12 mighty balsas, all christened in honor of Polynesian legendary figures whose names had once been borne with Tiki over the sea from Peru. The logs, glistening with sap, were dragged down through the jungle, first by horses and at the last by Don Frederico's tractor, which brought them to the riverbank in front of the bungalow. The sap-filled logs were far from being as light as corks. They must have weighed a ton apiece, and we waited with great anxiety to see how they would float in the water. We rolled them out to the edge of the bank one by one. There we made fast a rope of tough climbing plants to the ends of the logs, that they might not vanish downstream when we let them enter the water. Then we rolled them in turn down the bank and into the river. There was a mighty splash. They swung round and floated, about as much above as below the surface of the water, and when we went out along them they remained steady. We bound the timbers together with tough lianas that hung down from the tops of the jungle trees, so as to make 2 temporary rafts, one towing with the other. Then we loaded the rafts with all the bamboos and lianas we should need later, and Herman and I went on board with 2 men of mysterious mixed race, with whom we had no common language. Down the Palenque by raft. When we cut our moorings, we were caught by the whirling masses of water and went off downstream at a good pace. The last glimpse we had in the drizzle as we rounded the first headland was of our excellent friends standing on the edge of the point in front of the bungalow waving. Then we crept under a little shelter of green banana leaves and left steering problems to the 2 brown experts, who had stationed themselves one in the bow and one astern, each holding a large oar. They kept the raft in the swiftest current with ease, and we danced downstream on a winding course between sunken trees and sandbanks. When meal times came, we relieved our friends at the steering oars while they fried fish and breadfruit over a little fire regulated with wet clay. Roast chicken, eggs, and tropical fruits were also part of the menu on board, while the logs transported themselves and us at a fine speed down through the jungle toward the sea. When darkness fell upon the river, we crawled inside the hut and went to sleep. What did it matter now if the water swept and splashed round us? The more it rained, the swifter the current ran. The farther downstream we drifted, the thicker became the huts and native plantations, and soon there were regular villages on the banks. The traffic here consisted of dugout canoes punted along with long poles, and now and then we saw a little balsa raft loaded with heaps of green bananas bound for market. When the Palenque joined the Rio Goya, the water had risen so high that the paddle steamer was playing busily between Vinces and Cayagil down on the coast. To save valuable time, Herman and I each got a hammock on board the paddle steamer and streamed off across the thickly populated flat country to the coast. Our brown friends were to follow, drifting down alone with the timber. At Guayaquil, Herman and I parted. He was to remain at the mouth of the Gaya to stop the balsa logs as they came drifting down. Thence he was to take them as cargo on a coasting steamer to Peru, where he was to direct the building of the raft and make a faithful copy of the Indians' old-time vessels. I myself took the regular plane southward to Lima, the capital of Peru, to find a suitable building place for building the raft. On my arrival in Lima, I took the streetcar down to the port of Callao to find a place where we could build the raft. I saw at once that the whole harbor was chock full of ships and cranes and warehouses, with customs sheds and harbor offices and all the rest. And if there was any open beach farther out, it swarmed with bathers to such a degree that inquisitive people would pull the raft and fittings to pieces as soon as our backs were turned. Callao was now the most important port in a country of 7 million people, white and brown. Times had changed for raft builders in Peru even more than in Ecuador, and I saw only one possibility: to get inside the high concrete walls round the naval harbor, where armed men stood on guard behind the iron gate and cast menacing and suspicious looks on me and other unauthorized persons who loafed past the walls. If one could only get in there, one would be safe. I had met the Peruvian naval attaché in Washington and had a letter from him to support me. I went to the Ministry of Marine next day with a letter and sought an audience with the Minister of Marine, Manuel Nieto. He received in the morning in the elegant Empire drawing room of the ministry, gleaming with mirrors and gilding. After a time he himself came in with full uniform, a short, broadly built officer, as stern as Napoleon, straightforward and concise in his manner of speech. He asked why, and I said why. I asked to be allowed to build a wooden raft in the naval dockyard. "Young man," said the minister, drumming uneasily with his fingers, "you've come in by the window instead of by the door. I'll be glad to help you, but the order must come from the foreign minister to me. I can't let foreigners into the naval area and then give them the use of dockyard as a matter of course. Apply to the foreign ministry in writing, and good luck." I thought apprehensively of paper circulating and disappearing into the blue. Happy were the rude days of Kon-Tiki, when applications were an unknown hindrance. To see the foreign minister in person was considerably harder. Norway had no local legislation in Peru, and our helpful Consul General Barr could, therefore, take me no farther than the councillors of the foreign ministry. I was afraid things would go no further. Dr. Cohen's letter to the President of the Republic might come in useful now. So I sought through his adjutant an audience of His Excellency Don Jose Bustamante y Rivero, President of Peru. A day or two later, I was told to be at the palace at 12 o'clock. Lima is a modern city with 500,000 inhabitants and lies spread over a green plain at the foot of the desert mountains. The President's palace stands in the middle of the city and is strongly guarded by armed sentries in gaily colored costumes. An audience in Peru is a serious business, and a few people have seen the President, except on the screen. After registering, I was taken into one room by a man in white, then to a much handsomer room where I was greeted by a man in a gold-edged uniform. He took me into a large gilded room, splendidly decorated with gilded furniture, and left me alone. Then came another, and still another, imposing gentleman in uniform, who told me that the president sent me his greetings and would be free very soon when a meeting of ministers was over. 10 minutes later, steady steps once more broke the silence, and this time a man with gold laces and epaulets came in. I sprang briskly from the sofa and bowed deeply. The man bowed still more deeply and led me through several rooms and up a staircase with thick carpets. Then he left me in a tiny little room with a simple leather-covered chair and a sofa. In came a little man in a white suit, who greeted me amiably and remained standing. This was President Bustamante y Riviero.